Railguns, coil guns, Gauss weapons, mass drivers, these are all electromagnetic weapons, and they seem like they're everywhere in sci-fi these days. They've become an absolute staple of anything trying to feel a little more grounded, but it wasn't always like this. So when did these things get so popular, and where does this tech come from in the first place? Why can they shoot through anything? That's what we're looking at this week on Spacedock. First off, an introduction into what these weapons even are, what makes them work and stand out from standard guns. Simply put, they use some variety of electromagnetism to accelerate a projectile up to very high velocities. The main real ones are the railgun and coil gun, which work on different principles. Railguns are fairly technically simple. You run an electric current up a rail, across the projectile, and down another rail back to the start. The magnetic field shape this flowing current generates shoves the projectile down the length of the rails, and the more current you put in, the faster it goes. The main problem to deal with is the lightning-hot electrical arcs zapping between the projectile and the rails, which erodes them with every shot, so the rails get worn out pretty quickly. Coil guns have easier to grasp physics, but are more challenging on the technical side. In these, a magnetic projectile is pulled towards an activated electromagnetic coil ahead of it. The coil turns off when the projectile reaches it, and the next in line turns on, repeating the process over and over, faster and faster. Since the projectile doesn't even need to touch the magnets, there's no problems with erosion or anything like that. Instead, the difficulty comes from perfecting the coil activation timing. Either way, both are appealing because they can get much higher muzzle velocities than regular guns that use chemical propellants. This means electromagnetic weapons have a range advantage over their traditional kin, and they can deliver more energy to the target. That latter bit is what makes them so good at penetrating things, especially when they get up into the hypervelocity range. For some fictional things, I think there's also a more specific inspiration for this great penetration, which I'll get to in a minute. Another thing that needs to be considered is the projectile itself. For example, the long rod penetrator that tanks use is a great shape for punching through armor, but overall this level of detail is not something most fiction gets down to, which is fair enough. If fiction does show ammo, it's more likely to be very art-directed to look and feel cool instead, like the pingy ball on the Deep Rock Galactic coil gun or the huge flat-faced cylinder from Sidonia's heavy mass cannon. Beyond the shape, the projectile for most electromagnetic weapons can be really simple, since they just need to be conductive or magnetic. There's no need for propellants with a complex production chain and handling requirements. The weapon just needs electrical power to yeet stuff. This simplifies logistics and makes this type of device attractive as a transportation system, or even as an engine for a spacecraft. This is when they become mass drivers, since they're meant to be driving mass around. We'll have more on these beauties next week when we look at how to make a gun capable of reaching space, which you can check out early on our Patreon, linked below. So that's what these weapons actually are, but before we get to figuring out when they kicked off in fiction, we need to understand when they kicked off in real life. Coil guns are the earliest ones, with Norwegian inventor Christian Birkeland patenting his idea in 1904. 30 years after that, Virgil Rigsby built his crazy-looking electric machine gun, and around that time, an electric cannon was featured in Modern Mechanics magazine. There's been all sorts of experimental stuff throughout the years since then, with one of the more serious concepts being a silent mortar, but overall, coil guns remain the unloved cousin of the railgun. These things were first invented in 1917 in France by André Louis... this guy. There were a few tries at weaponizing it, with this guy being commissioned in the First World War to make them into cannons. A test model was built and fired, but then the war ended and so did the project. The Germans in the Second World War looked into the concept with the idea of making high-velocity anti-air guns, but none were ever built. The main limiting factor for both was the prodigious power requirements to make them viable. The first real major effort towards developing railguns started in the 80s in America and lasted a good 30 years, though with varying goals over time. At first it was for scientific purposes, then it turned into ballistic missile defense, then in the 90s it came back to general weapons development, before morphing into the well-known US Navy railgun project in the 2000s, which disappointingly fizzled out into nothing. At least other countries, including India, China and Japan, have been doing their own R&D, which is continuing to this day. So despite both coils and rails being feasible, railguns have had a lot more development, because if you have the power and can deliver it to the gun, you just gotta work on improving the materials of the rails to extend their lifetime. With coil guns, you need the power delivery and extremely precise timing for every single shot. At least there's hobby versions. I reckon this developmental disparity is probably also why coil guns are so much less common in fiction, but they are around. Which brings us to the progression of electromagnetic weapons throughout fiction, which I think can be put into 3 separate eras, roughly matching up with their real-life progression. The first era starts in literature, with The Moon is a Harsh Mistress having an electromagnetic catapult in 1966. There could certainly be older ones than this, I'm no historian after all, but if there are, it doesn't really change the overall era, which lasted up to the 90s, going through the likes of Hammers, Slammers and Wing Commander, which included unspecified electromagnetic technologies. Later, things get more specific, including amusing things like G.I. Joe comics having a railgun in 1993, and there's also plenty of mass drivers that probably took their inspiration from those that came before. The second era kicks in the mid-90s, probably as a consequence of further R&D into them, which might have shown up in the news or on TV for creators to see. A really plugged-in person might have even been seeing the research documents coming out about them. The real defining fictional example from this era is Eraser, a 1996 movie that featured railguns as this groundbreaking weapons tech that can see and shoot through anything. I think this is where that trope comes from, or at least where it might have been popularized, because after this movie, railguns started showing up more and more, especially in video games like Quake 2, Metal Gear Solid, Command & Conquer, Ace Combat and more. Now, the ones from Japan, well, I don't know if this eraser theory holds up, but for Western stuff, I think it does. Of particular note is Perfect Dark's Farsight and Red Faction's Rail Driver, both of which seem directly based on the one in Eraser, since both can see and shoot through walls. We're now well into the new millennium, where the US Navy railgun program had started up, which is roughly when the third era started. Electromagnetic weapons are showing up more and more in futuristic fiction like EVE Online and Halo 2, possibly inspired by earlier eras as well as real-life developments, but the big important leap in popularity was Transformers 2 in 2007, which directly features a US Navy vessel firing its absurdly wide railgun at Devastator's balls. After this mainstream inclusion, such weapons really started to show up a lot more, to the point where they're basically a fundamental part of the genre, kinda like how we see plasma weapons everywhere. There's even a railgun Pokemon! However, there are still some notable exceptions that don't include them, like Avatar, which probably doesn't. There, the military tech is instead a futuristic version of Vietnam-era US stuff, plus mechs. It's just like Aliens really, which only has railguns tucked away into the lore thanks to the Colonial Marines technical manual. So what do you think of my era's theory? Does it hold up? Also, do you think coil guns need to be shown more love, or are railguns just inherently so much cooler? If you want more on all these things, then we've got you covered, like this video on the amazing rail-coil hybrid you can check out next. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate, fighter and carrier design reference books, as well as 1 week early access to upcoming videos. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.